It was a cold, biting evening in Washington, D.C. The kind that made the streets feel emptier than they really were, as if the wind was sweeping away the last traces of life. The city was still, silent, save for the rush of wind against the looming buildings. Inside the presidential motorcade, President Donald Trump sat in the back of his limousine, his mind far from the briefings laid out before him. The weight of the day, a series of tense meetings, difficult decisions, pressed down on his shoulders. His eyes drifted out the window as the car slowed at an intersection. It was an ordinary street, filled with the ordinary sights of the capital, but something caught his attention. A figure. A man. Alone. Huddled on the curb, his back hunched against the cold, the thin fabric of his jacket doing nothing to shield him from the biting wind. A battered cardboard sign beside him read, "Veteran. Homeless. Hungry. Please help." Trump's gaze lingered on the man, his mind racing. The motorcade continued its slow roll, but for a moment the world outside the window seemed to freeze. The man's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. It was a sight that struck a chord deep within him. He tapped on the window, his voice sharp as he called out, "Stop the car." One of the Secret Service agents hesitated. "Sir, that's not advisable." "I said stop the car," Trump repeated, his tone firm. The vehicle came to a halt. The door swung open and without another word, Trump stepped into the cold, his security detail scrambling to surround him. But he was already moving toward the figure on the curb. The man looked up, startled, eyes wide with disbelief. The harshness of his gaze softened when he saw the president standing before him, a figure of power yet strangely not one of distance. Trump crouched down slightly, his gaze steady. "What's your name?" he asked softly. The man blinked, clearly caught off guard. His voice came out raspy, worn by years of silence or maybe the bitter chill. "Richard. Richard Wilson. Richard, what happened to you?" The words came out in a pained whisper. "I served in Afghanistan. Lost my leg in an IED blast. Came home. Everything fell apart. Couldn't keep a job, couldn't pay the bills. My wife left. And now I'm here." Trump listened, a heavy silence settling between them. There was no judgment in his eyes, just an unspoken understanding. Then without a word he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pair of gloves. He held them out. "You served your country," Trump said, his voice low, sincere. "It's time your country served you." As Trump handed Richard the gloves, a strange quiet hung in the air. The cold seemed to retreat just slightly, as if the warmth of the simple gesture had shifted something unseen. Richard took the gloves, his hands trembling as he slid them on, his lips parting in a silent thank you. But the look in his eyes, part disbelief, part gratitude, spoke volumes. Trump turned and gestured to his security detail. "Bring him with us," he said, his voice resolute. "Now." There was a brief exchange of confusion among the Secret Service agents, but no one dared question the president. Richard was helped to his feet, the prosthetic leg awkwardly shifting under him, while Trump motioned for the motorcade to be redirected. The quiet hum of the cars filled the silence, but in Trump's mind, the echoes of the encounter with Richard reverberated loudly. As the motorcade made its way toward Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, Trump couldn't shake the image of the man sitting on the curb. The entire situation felt wrong. How could someone who had served his country, someone who had given so much, be left to rot on the streets, forgotten by the very system he fought to protect? The ride to Walter Reed was quiet. Too quiet, save for the occasional questions Trump posed to Richard, probing deeper into the life he had lost. "How long have you been on the streets, Richard?" Trump asked, his voice softer now as though trying to understand. 2 years, Richard replied, his eyes staring down at his hands, his voice devoid of hope. "I tried shelters, but they're overcrowded. And it's not what they promised. Not by a long shot." Trump clenched his jaw, frustration building within him. He had heard the stories, he knew the numbers. Tens of thousands of veterans like Richard, discarded by the system, left to fend for themselves. It was a failure, plain and simple. And it was his job to fix it. They arrived at Walter Reed, the sprawling medical center humming with activity. Trump's entourage quickly ushered Richard inside, where doctors and nurses took charge, assessing his condition, running tests. The president stood by, his hands clenched, his mind whirling with thoughts of how to right this wrong. Hours passed, but Trump didn't leave. He walked the halls, speaking with the medical staff, making sure that Richard received immediate attention. "Make sure he gets everything he needs," Trump told them, his tone unwavering. "And I mean everything. I'll cover the cost personally if I have to." Over the next few days, Trump couldn't get Richard out of his mind. He spent hours poring over reports on veteran homelessness, healthcare, and the systems in place. Or rather, the lack of systems in place to support those who had given so much. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of veterans across the country were homeless, many of them dealing with physical disabilities, mental health issues, and addiction. The more he read, the angrier he became. How had it gotten this bad? How had his country, his government, allowed this to happen? He called a cabinet meeting. When the room settled, he demanded answers. "How did this happen?" Trump asked, his voice sharp with frustration. "How did so many of our veterans end up on the streets? What's the excuse here?" The room was filled with mumbling and shuffling papers, but no one had a satisfactory answer. Some blamed bureaucracy. Others pointed to funding shortages. Some blamed the inefficiencies of the Veterans Affairs system. Trump didn't want to hear excuses. "No more delays," he said firmly, cutting off the responses before they could even form. "We're going to fix this. And we're going to do it now. No more bureaucracy. No more red tape. We need solutions." As the meeting ended, Trump's thoughts turned once again to Richard. The man had already begun to recover, but there were still so many others out there like him, struggling, forgotten. Trump knew that it wasn't enough to just help Richard. He had to help them all. The country needed to wake up to the reality that these men and women who had sacrificed everything for their country were being left behind. That evening, Trump returned to Walter Reed. He found Richard sitting up in bed, looking much better, his color returning, but still grappling with the guilt of his past. "You came back," Richard said, surprise in his voice. Trump nodded, sitting beside him. "Of course I did. How are they treating you?" "Better than I deserve," Richard replied, his voice a mix of relief and guilt. "There are so many others like me out there. I'm lucky." Trump's gaze softened. "We'll help them too." As Richard's recovery progressed, he began to open up more. His voice, once hollow and empty, now had a depth to it. He spoke about his time in the Army, about his decision to enlist right out of high school. It had been an escape, he admitted, from a rough neighborhood. The military had given him a sense of purpose, discipline, and strength. But all of that had crumbled when he lost his leg. "I lost everything that day," Richard said quietly, staring at his hands as if they held the remnants of his former life. "The military gave me everything, and then it took it all away. I didn't know who I was without it." Trump listened intently. Every word Richard spoke hit him harder than the last. The explosion, the pain, the sudden emptiness. Richard's story was one of many, but in that moment it felt personal. Trump's respect for Richard grew with each passing day. He began to understand what needed to be done, and he wasn't going to wait for others to act. He gathered a team of experts from various fields: healthcare, housing, job training, and social services. It wasn't just a plan, it was a mission. "We owe these men and women everything," Trump told them. "We're going to fix this starting now. No more excuses. I want real solutions." Trump's focus on Richard didn't waver. He personally arranged for Richard to stay at the Trump International Hotel, offering him a temporary place while a permanent solution was found. The president also arranged for Richard to be fitted with a state-of-the-art prosthetic leg, one that would allow him to walk without crutches for the first time in years. When Richard took his first steps without crutches, he grinned. Pure joy radiated from his face. This changes everything," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Trump's smile was subtle, but it was genuine. "It's just the beginning." Trump's commitment to Richard's recovery and the larger cause went far beyond personal gestures. Richard's success became a symbol, a powerful reminder of what was at stake. But Trump wasn't satisfied with simply helping one man. He wanted to change the system to ensure that no veteran had to suffer the way Richard had. Richard's life was gradually rebuilding. He was fitted with a new prosthetic leg which allowed him to walk, not just move. Each step he took brought him closer to the life he once knew, but it was more than just physical recovery. It was about reclaiming his identity, the very essence of who he was before the explosion took it all away. Trump's team went to work, drafting plans for a nationwide initiative. It wasn't just a policy, it was a movement. The Veterans First initiative would focus on providing veterans with the health care, housing, and job training they deserved. No more waiting. No more bureaucracy. Trump often visited Richard, checking in on his progress, offering words of encouragement, and making sure the necessary resources were in place. "How's the job search going?" Trump would ask, genuinely interested in how Richard was doing. "It's been hard," Richard would admit, but each time there was more hope in his voice. "But I'm starting to believe again. Thanks to you, I've got a chance." News of Richard's transformation spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about one man's recovery. It was about showing the country that change was possible, that something could be done. People were inspired, and it wasn't long before communities all across the nation began demanding more for their veterans. The Veterans First initiative took off, surpassing all expectations. Shelters were built. Counseling services were expanded. Job placement programs were established. But perhaps most importantly, veterans knew they were being heard. They weren't invisible anymore. Richard, now a living example of the initiative's power, became its unofficial ambassador. He traveled the country sharing his story with anyone who would listen. He spoke at events, met with veterans, and even appeared in news segments, advocating for the changes that were happening. It wasn't easy, but the ripple effect had begun. More and more veterans were finding hope in the programs Trump had championed. Richard's life wasn't just a success story. It was proof that when the right people take action, things can get better. A year had passed since that fateful night when Trump stopped for Richard on the street. Richard stood at a podium, dressed in a sharp suit, his prosthetic leg barely visible beneath his trousers. He looked nothing like the broken man sitting on the curb just 12 months ago. The gala was packed with supporters, all of them eager to hear Richard's story, the story that had changed so many lives. When he stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. "I was lost," Richard began, his voice wavering slightly. "I thought my life was over. But then someone stopped. Someone who didn't have to. Someone who had every reason to keep driving past me. That moment changed everything." The audience erupted in applause, but Richard's gaze remained fixed on the front row where Trump sat, his presence commanding. He was the reason Richard stood here today. Trump took the stage after Richard, his words filled with conviction. "Richard is a reminder of what makes this country great," he said, his voice booming through the microphone. "Resilience, courage, and the determination to never give up. But let me tell you something, his story is not unique. There are thousands of Richards out there. Men and women who've given everything for us, and it's our responsibility to give back to them." The applause was deafening. This wasn't just about Richard. It was about every veteran who had fallen through the cracks, every life that had been disregarded. Trump was using his position to make sure their voices were heard. The evening closed with the announcement of a new program, the Heroes Fund, a nationwide initiative dedicated to eradicating veteran homelessness. It would fund housing, healthcare, and job training, ensuring that veterans would no longer be left to fend for themselves. The Heroes Fund became a national success. Thousands of veterans found new hope, their lives transformed by the very programs that Trump had worked so tirelessly to establish. And Richard was there every step of the way, not just as a recipient of help, but as a force for change. He was the living embodiment of the transformation that was possible when people cared enough to take action. Trump continued to push for systemic change, using his platform to advocate for veterans' needs long after the eventful gala. He knew that no matter how much had been done, there was still more work to be done. Veterans, after all, were more than just a statistic. They were people, real people who had fought for the country, and now it was time for the country to fight for them. Years later, Richard stood outside a newly opened veterans housing center in Chicago, Wilson's Way, named in his honor. The plaque on the wall glistened in the sunlight, and as Richard ran his hand over it, tears streamed down his face. Behind him, a group of veterans gathered, each of them a testament to the success of the programs he had helped to create. "I never thought my name would mean anything," Richard said softly to a reporter standing nearby. "But now, it stands for hope." As for Trump, his mission didn't stop when he left office. Even in retirement, he remained dedicated to ensuring that no veteran would ever be left behind again. The legacy of his leadership, born out of a chance encounter on a cold street in Washington, D.C., would endure for years to come. The story of Richard Wilson was more than just a tale of one man's recovery. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples that change the world. And when those ripples spread far enough, they could become a tidal wave of hope that would change lives forever.